Okay, team, we are back talking about population genetics and Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium population. If you recall from the last video, Hardy and Weinberg were population geneticists, and they hypothesized or theorized about a kind of a hypothetical population of organism that did not evolve. And they came up with some criteria, and you can see here what the criteria were. No mutation, no gene flow between populations. In other words, no net movement of alleles into or out of a population. So let's think about that. What does that mean? Well, it means nobody can come and nobody can go. And we'll talk more about that. Population must be infinitely large. The reason population needs to be infinitely large is to sort of water down chance mutation. Of course, we're saying mutations aren't occurring at all, but we'll talk more about that. The larger the population, the less likely a given mutation is to take hold or take root. You're going to love this one. All mating must be random. So you shut out the lights and you move around and you bump into somebody and that's your mate. Y'all going to go for that? Yeah, I didn't think so. And then there can be no natural selection. All genotypes are equally adaptive. So, basically all genotypes are created equal in their hypothetical population. So then what we want to say is, can this exist in nature? If this can exist in nature, then that disproves the theory of evolution in a sense, right? Well, what do you think? Can it exist in nature? Can this hypothetical population exist? As far as mutation goes, right off the bat, we have some issues with this hypothetical population because we cannot control mutation, right? Mutation, we know, simply occurs, and we don't really have much control over it. There are, like we said, certain triggers, which, we may have some control over the triggers. But other than that, we know that mutation is just going to occur in individuals in a population. Migration of individuals into and out of population produces gene flow and a change in the allele frequency. Remember, we're measuring evolution by a change in the allele frequencies, okay? Well, if nothing else, people are going to die. And if the population is going to continue, people are going to be born. So right away, we have an issue with no gene flow in a population. Small populations, it's important to understand, are subject to random changes that spread quickly. We call this genetic drift. And so you could imagine a very small population where a mutation crops up. And if that mutation happens to be beneficial, it will spread very quickly throughout the population. The larger the population, the less the effects of chance become limited, okay? So it takes a lot longer for a chance mutation to spread. In an infinitely large population, it could never spread because the population is infinitely large. So there are a couple of things we want to talk about. One is a population bottleneck, and another is founder effect. And population bottleneck, I think we probably have enough room on the screen here to do it. Let's see. Really good example of population bottleneck is what we've seen with cheetahs, which are, the big cats. What happens in a population bottleneck is you have a relatively large population that over time gets really small. That's the bottleneck right there. And then over time, it expands back out. So it starts out large, gets small, and then gets large again. And again, good example of a population bottleneck, what we're talking about here, would be cheetahs. There used to be many, many cheetahs on the earth. There were very large populations. Over time, they got smaller and smaller and smaller, and then humans intervened, and they said, if we don't intervene, we're going to lose this species. And so they protected the cheetah, they intervened, and now the population is relatively large. However, population biologists tell us we may still lose the cheetah due to the sort of watering down of the genes, right? When this happens, although there are a lot of cheetahs, they're all the cheetahs from this, when this population was very small. There were about 300 cheetahs at this point. And so what that means is that genetically they're all just about the same, and that's not good, right? You want genetic variability within your population to limit the effects of disease and things like that. And so population biologists say, we may still lose the cheetah to a disease for which none of them happen to be resistant. So there's that. Founder effect, this right here is also interesting. This occurs when you have a relatively small number of individuals colonizing an area and becoming the population. Good example here is with the Amish that came to the United States. All of the Amish that came to the United States, there were 64 Amish people that came to the United States. From those 64 people, because they only breed, if you will, or reproduce within their religion and within their community, all of them are descendants of these 64 individuals. And because of that, we see founder effect. We see certain diseases, for example, that are very common, much more common amongst the Amish, because some of these 64 individuals were carriers for that. Whereas if the population was giant, those mutations would be watered down. Okay. So hopefully that explains some of the Hardy-Weinberg. What are we learning? Well, it probably can't exist in real life, right? Let's see. Mating within a population, we said, had to be completely random. The idea there is, random mating is like random chance. It doesn't favor anything. That's nearly never the case. There are different mating regimes or schemes that occur in naturally occurring populations of living things. One of the most common is called harem breeding. And in harem breeding, which we see in species of birds, including domesticated chickens and turkeys, and also in wolves, is that there's one male that's dominant, and that one male breeds all of the females. So how does that male determine his dominance? By beating the crap out of all the others. So if you've ever had chickens, for example, and you have two roosters, those roosters will fight for dominance. One of them will become the dominant male, and that dominant male will breed all of the hens, and the other rooster just has to sit there and watch. Must be a little bit humiliating, but that's the way it works. Another type of mating scheme is called assortative mating, where you mate with similar looking individuals. So you seek out an individual that looks the most like you, and you mate with that individual. And you could imagine this kind of keeps the population pretty stable. The oddballs don't get to mate. Okay. And then the last one is called sexual selection, where one sex, usually the female, gets to choose the mate. Okay. So I'd like to think, it's hard to say what humans are because we're conscious beings, but certainly there's some sexual selection involved, right? There's usually some agreement. Somebody chooses, okay? So the point is that these exist in nature, and they're mating within a population is almost never random. And then the last one is, unfortunately, all genotypes are not created equal. Right? So as much as we would like for there to be a level playing field for everyone, and although our society dictates that there's supposed to be a level playing field for everyone, genetically speaking, we're not all the same. And because of that, some individuals are more likely to survive than others. And a good example of that is the BRCA gene, which predisposes women to breast cancer. If women have 2 copies of this particular gene, which is a gene mutation, then they have an 80% chance of getting breast cancer. So very, very high risk. And then it also predisposes men to prostate cancer. This is a bad gene, and some people carry it, and so they're not genetically as fit as other people. So the point is that Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium population can't really exist in nature. Not only does evolution occur, you can't even stop it if you try. Okay. So the next topic is natural selection. Trying to understand, how does nature select for a given genotype? And what are the conditions and what are the outcomes of these different types of selection? Okay. So we have directional selection, excuse me, stabilizing selection, disruptive selection, and something called balanced polymorphism. So we're going to go, let's hop out of this particular slide and do a little chalk and talk. We'll come back to these back and forth, okay? Because we really need to draw a graph. A graph is really going to be the best way to understand this. And we'll start with directional selection, which says, you know, in directional selection, we favor individuals at one end of a continuum. So if you remember when we were doing Mendelian genetics and we talked about polygenetic inheritance, and we said, you know, a good example of that is height in humans. And then we made a graph. And so let's make that graph again. If this is the number of individuals, and this is their height, we said, you know, if we graph this data from a population, we'd get this nice bell curve like this, right? And so what that just means is most people are average and there are a few people on the short side and a few people on the tall end, okay? So with that said, directional selection favors individuals at one end of a continuum, okay? So let's just say there was some selective pressure that only favored the short people. Okay, what is that going to do to the population over time? If only the short people are selected for, or you could just as easily say only the tall people, it's going to drive the population in this direction, isn't it? Okay, and so over time with something like directional selection, what's going to happen is the population is going to over time get shorter for whatever reason, whatever that pressure happens to be. Okay. So that's one type of natural selection. Stabilizing selection favors the average. Okay, so let's think about that. What if we just favor the average? What does that do? Well, the names, the nice thing about this is the names kind of tell you what's going to happen, right? This is stabilizing selection. If you always favor the average, then the average stays the average. And so this is going to have a stabilizing effect on the population. Height is probably not going to change very much from one generation to the next for whatever reason nature is selecting for this average. Okay. Then there's disruptive selection, which is really fascinating. Let's do that in a different color. Do that in blue. Disruptive selection, as the name implies, has a dramatic disruptive effect by favoring both extremes over the average. And so, you know, we wonder how speciation occurs. How does, you know, one species become two species? Well, imagine if this happened, right? There's some environmental factor that's causing this natural selection to favor the shortest people and the tallest people. Well, the shortest people then are going to get shorter and shorter, and the tallest people are going to get taller and taller. Eventually, it's possible that the short people get so short and the tall people get so tall that they're no longer sexually compatible with one another, you might say. This can drive speciation. This can cause two new species to evolve over time. Over time could be thousands, millions of years, who knows, okay? So you're favoring the extremes, okay, at the expense of the average. That's what disruptive selection is. And then the last one is called balanced polymorphism. This is a really fascinating one. In balanced polymorphism, you have two separate selective pressures. Favoring different genotypes. Okay, here's a good example. One of the best examples of balanced polymorphism ends up being in sickle cell anemia in humans. And here's the deal. If you are homozygous dominant, you have no sickle cell anemia, you are normal. Sickle cell anemia, just so you know, individuals that have it, their red blood cells are shaped like this, they're sickle shaped, and they can't carry the oxygen. If you have sickle cell anemia, it's a death sentence, you're gonna die. And these individuals don't typically live to maturity. So if you're homozygous dominant, obviously you don't have sickle cell anemia. It's a homozygous recessive trait. However, you are susceptible to malaria, highly susceptible. And malaria, prior to treatment and still in many third world countries, is fatal. It kills you. So, you know, although this is a good genotype to have because you don't have sickle cell disease, it's a bad genotype to have because you're prone to malaria, you're highly susceptible, okay? If you have two little s's, you have sickle cell anemia, which means you're gonna die, unfortunately, but you are immune to malaria. See, so now we have two separate selective pressures favoring different genotypes. The two separate selective pressures are this blood disease and a parasitic infection, okay? Well, there's a third genotype, right? So if you're homozygous dominant, that's not so great because you're probably going to get malaria. If you're homozygous recessive, you got sickle cell anemia, that sucks. But what if you have a big S and a little s? Well, it turns out that if you have a big S and a little s, you don't have sickle cell anemia, although you're a carrier, and you are quite resistant to malaria. For whatever reason, the slightly deformed shape of the red blood cell makes you resistant to malaria. This is the genotype that's the fittest, right? Because you have these two separate selective pressures. And guess what? As long as this genotype is the fittest, then there's always going to be individuals with these other two, because you know when you breed two of these together, you're going to get some homozygous dominant and some homozygous recessive. This is what keeps sickle cell disease in the gene pool, is simply that this genotype is the fittest. Okay, so this is very intricate ideas here with population genetics, very interesting. So just to reiterate, directional selection favors one extreme, drives the population in a direction. Disruptive selection favors the two extremes at the expense of the average, drives the population in two separate directions. Stabilizing selection favors the median or the average, which stabilizes, keeps the population kind of right where it is. And then in balanced polymorphism, we have two separate selective pressures favoring different genotypes, as we saw here. Good. All good stuff there to learn. Okay. So altruism is an interesting concept. It's an important selective force. Altruism is any behavior exhibited by an individual that endangers that individual for the benefit of the species as a whole, or perhaps for the benefit of your offspring. And so the idea is, if you reproduce and pass your genes on, if you can keep your offspring alive, that's in some ways better than keeping you alive. And so, you know, altruistic behavior, we see it all the time. Now, it can have, you can think of it from a social impact, you know, or a social example might be, you know, the mother endangering her life to save her child. That's kind of a, you know, kind of the thing that we see. Kind of the ultimate altruistic behavior in humans might be soldiers at war, and the hand grenade gets chunked into the bunker, and one of the soldiers dives on the hand grenade to save his comrades, right? Well, in nature, we see altruistic behavior occurring. A good example is the killdeer that fakes a broken wing to lure the fox away from her babies. And we can look at a video of this. Let's see. Oops, don't want to search across my channel. Here, let's just do this. Bear with me for a second. This is also sometimes called kin selection. I think this is the one that we usually watch. Let's see.
You're looking at a killdeer on her nest. Harder to see when the camera backs off. Well, she counts on that since she nests on the ground. Sometimes, though, her camouflage gets blown. When that happens, plan B is to lure the intruder away. First, by simply standing in plain sight, moving away gradually. If the raccoon or snake or you don't follow, then she steps it up a notch and goes into her broken wing act, assuming that the sight of an injured bird will galvanize any predator. So she has been known to step out of character momentarily. But if, despite her drama, you go closer to the eggs, she'll come even nearer. She'll heighten her performance. She's brave about protecting those babies.
Okay, so there you have it, an example of altruistic behavior, right? And what about extinction? Well, when a species fails to survive on Earth, we say it's been extirpated or it's become extinct. And what the paleontologists tell us is that 99.9% of all Earth's species have become extinct. We've had mass extinction events, almost always due to a rapid change in the environment. If you look at the current theory about what happened to the dinosaurs, we believe that a large meteor struck the Earth right off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, landed in the water, and you might think, well, what's the big deal if it landed in the water? Well, just the force and the amount of water vapor that got kicked up into the atmosphere would have blotted out the sun for many, many days or maybe even years. We don't know for sure. But of course, when the sun gets blotted out, plants die very quickly. And once the plants go, then the animals go. And so, extinction occurs. It is a naturally occurring event. There has been in the past in nature, but now humans, due to our activity, have dramatically sped up extinction of species on Earth, mostly due to habitat loss. Okay. And then there's this idea of speciation. How does one species become two? And there are a variety of answers to this. There are varieties of different kinds of speciation. The kind of speciation that I want you to know is called allopatric speciation. It's a type of speciation that occurs when two populations become geographically isolated from one another. And so we might think about how this might happen. One really good example, the Isthmus of Panama, if you know anything about Panama, It's this very narrow country like this. And on one side is the Pacific Ocean, and on the other side is the Atlantic, right? And what we think happened over time is that as the Panama rose up out of the ocean, and so before it rose up, the Atlantic and the Pacific were connected right here. And so just try to imagine there was that one moment in time when they became separated. And so the population of fish, for example, on this side, suddenly became isolated from the population of fish on this side. And there's this fish called a wrasse that lives here. There's the Pacific wrasse and the Caribbean wrasse. And they're strikingly similar yet different. And so we believe probably they were one species. And once they became geographically isolated, speciation occurred, allopatric speciation occurred because of differences in habitat from one side to the other over millions of years, okay? We see a similar thing in squirrels in the Grand Canyon. There are squirrels. I'm not going to try to draw a squirrel. Oh, what the heck, I'll draw a little squirrel here. There's its bushy tail and its legs. And then here's one on the other side. And again, they look similar to one another, but they have become geographically isolated by this gorge that is the Grand Canyon. It's believed that at one time there were one population. Now the gorge is so deep they can't get back and forth. And so they are no longer sexually compatible. They can't reproduce with one another. Okay. So allopatric speciation is a type of speciation that occurs when two populations become geographically isolated. There are other types of speciation. I'll just give you an example that you don't have to worry about, but I'll just tell you there's one called sympatric speciation where they're separated by time. And an example of that is with fruit flies. And fruit flies might evolve, a mutation might occur that makes them only come out in the morning or only come out in the evening, in which case they're not interacting with the other fruit flies, and this can lead to speciation as well. But the one that I'll ask you about is allopatric. Okay. And I believe that that is the last slide of the show. Let me get rid of some of this stuff just to make sure. Yes, that's the last slide of the show. So I guess we'll stop there for now. And I will tell you, there is another slideshow. There is another PowerPoint. Let's just take a second to take a look at that. That would make sense. Let's see what we've got left. The next slideshow deals with what you might think of as macroevolution rather than microevolution. So, now we're looking at or wanting to look at, the big picture. And that actually starts with the Big Bang Theory. We're to start talking about the origin of the Earth and how we got where we did over time. And now we're getting into quantum physics, right? And it's very complicated. It's hard to wrap your brain around the idea of the Big Bang Theory, but we'll watch a video or two and try to understand a little bit about it. I'm not going to expect that you understand all of the quantum physics, but you can see here there's a PowerPoint called the Big Bang Theory, or the Big Bang and macroevolution. Now, we were just in this evolution PowerPoint. So if we click on this, we can just read this first slide and we'll come back to it next time. The Big Bang Theory is the leading explanation about how the universe began. At its simplest, it says the universe, as we know it, started with a small singularity that inflated over the next 13.8 billion years to the cosmos that we know today. And I mean, what is that saying? Well, you interpret it how you like. We'll watch a few videos, try to understand a little more about it. But the point is that the universe we know from background radiation is still expanding in all directions. And so the universe still continues to grow from this singularity. Okay. All right, team, it's been a pleasure. I will catch you on the flip side. I hope you're well. Hope you're enjoying things. Enjoy life while you can. Bye-bye. I'll see you next time.